You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 3rd of July, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Macron and Putin back on speaking terms, but what did they discuss? President Donald Trump's protection racket claims another client, and what makes a city walkable? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Marta Lorimer and Simon Brooke will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is sent from the factory which makes the things with which many, many letters have been written. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Marta Lorimer, lecturer in politics at Cardiff University, and by Simon Brooke, journalist and communications consultant. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Marta, you can go first and make everybody just incandescently jealous, both here in the studio and I'm sure wherever our listeners are. You're going to Italy for ages.
Yes, one of the great privileges of being Italian is that I get to go there whenever I want. And I have chosen to go to Florence, where my family is, and also to go to Sardinia, where I like to holiday.
What is it about Sardinia? Is it the sardines?
No, it's that my mom is from there.
Okay. I've never been to Sardinia. What would you recommend about Sardinia for somebody who might think, I've never been to Sardinia and I should go there?
I would recommend eating everything.
But you could say that that's everywhere in Italy.
That is everywhere in Italy, but Sardinia also has beautiful beaches, and if you're not into the beaches, it also has, it's still somewhat remote, and there are parts of it that are still a little bit wilder than others.
Okay.
And I think it's just such a beautiful place. My favourite place there is a prison island that is no longer a prison, it's now a natural park, and I think it's just the most beautiful place on earth.
Did Sardinia ever have a sort of like weirdo independence movement which consisted of about 6 people who twice a year would blow up a post box?
It's fun that you should ask that. Of course they do. And if you ever see any public event in Italy, you will see the Sardinian flag somewhere.
I'm a big fan of obscurantist liberation movements.
Wonderful.
All the more enticement. Simon, you, meanwhile, here in London, have, as I understand it, unlocked the secret to getting Londoners to speak to you. Not clear to me why anybody would want to do that, but since you have, let's have it.
I totally agree with you, Andrew. I have to say I'm naturally an invert. I don't necessarily want to have conversations with anyone. Problem, of course, with being a writer, you spend a lot of time sitting at your desk and not speaking to anybody. So
Again, you're saying this like it's a bad thing.
Exactly. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But you do have to get out and meet people and face the world to avoid going completely bonkers. And I had a dog foisted on me about 6 months ago now. Mm-hmm. Wasn't keen at all. My partner decided we had to get a dog. And now I'm sold on dog ownership. Gets you out of your office, gets you meeting people. I've always been really jealous of friends who have had young children because of this amazing conversation that women especially, even these days, have at the school gate, you know, with other parents, whatever, and the friendships. And I remember even writing a piece about businesses that were formed by women who'd had a conversation at the school gate. So I don't have kids, but a dog seems to perform the same service.
What's the dog called?
He's called Finn. He's an Irish dog. We came from Ireland, so he barks in Irish.
Okay,
not really.
Well, big hello, Finn, if you're listening. We will start in France, from where a call has been made to Russia. President Emmanuel Macron of the former and President Vladimir Putin of the latter have reportedly had their first conversation in 3 years or so. However, the primary topic was apparently not Ukraine, but Iran. As Iran announced it was ending all cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, Macron was reminding Putin that Russia has previously been no keener on the idea of an Iranian bomb than anyone else, and was hoping that Putin might be able to talk the Ayatollahs back round. Things have changed, though, Marta, since Russia did sign the JCPOA, the agreement which initially restricted Iran's nuclear programs. At this point, though, might they quite like the idea of another somewhat rogue state distracting everybody else?
Why not? It's always nice to have some relief from the pressure of no one wanting to talk to you. And I suspect that Putin might have enjoyed those 2 hours he spent speaking to Macron. And My favorite explanation for why this happened is that he's also frustrated with Trump, and that's why he even agreed to this. But I don't really know if this phone call actually went anywhere and if it persuaded Putin to make any kind of concessions on Ukraine.
But even if it didn't, Simon, is it smart by Macron to actually open up this channel of communications? There's some analysis suggesting that the reason he did this on the pretext of talking about Iran was to ensure that the discourse on Ukraine wasn't entirely conducted between Putin and Trump.
I have to say, I had a real feeling of déjà vu, as the Macron camp might say. Do you remember we had these long conversations along a long table, didn't we, between Putin and Macron in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And, Macron was supposedly going to persuade Putin not to carry out that act of aggression. And it failed miserably. All that happened was Macron spent so much time talking to Putin, he didn't have enough time to talk to the electors of France, who then, caused him terrible electoral damage in the legislative elections. So it didn't work well there. I don't think it's going to work well now. I mean, obviously Putin is enjoying posturing, isn't he? He loves the idea of these long conversations. Once again, he's the focus. Will he, won't he? But I think it's worth remembering that Russia isn't nearly as powerful in the Middle East now as it was when it had Bashar al-Assad's Syria as a client state. The crinks, as they're called, China, Russia, in Iran and North Korea, are not nearly as strong. They've sort of fractured to some extent. And also, Putin just doesn't have that power anymore. So, yes, I suppose it's good for him to look as if he's once more, very much at the centre of geopolitics. But I can't see what Macron or Europe is going to get out of this.
Marta, on that thought of Iran not being as powerful as it once was, and it's not just that their former puppet Assad in Syria has been removed. Their network of proxies across the Middle East, the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, have been substantially diminished. Them doing things like saying we're suspending cooperation with the IAEA, it's a bluff, isn't it? Because now they absolutely know, they can be in no doubt about what happens if people think they're getting anywhere near actually building a nuclear weapon.
Sure, but the way they are trying to sell this is, again, Iran is trying to stay relevant, presumably, and survive. And they are trying to make a point, right? That they need to have nuclear power for reasons of security. And I think that it is quite a challenging environment for them to either have it or not have it. And that's where this is sort of where the problem comes in for Europeans, because they have, it's very clear that they don't want Iran to have it, but they also don't.
But nobody wants Iran to have a bomb.
No. Apart from Iranians. But they're also not really sure how to completely prevent them from having it. So they need to find this kind of compromise solution where you say, well, yes, you can have nuclear power, but you definitely cannot make a bomb with it. And Macron seems to have decided that it is his responsibility in Europe to do something about it, because no one else seems to be in a position to actually make a move.
Macron does seem to suggest, Simon, and this is a difference between Macron and the rhetoric we've heard from the Americans, that he's not necessarily against Iran being able to enrich uranium for peaceful domestic energy generating purposes. Now, Iran has done this absurd thing for years of claiming that's all we ever really wanted, and yet it was well known that in recent years they were enriching uranium far past the point that was necessary for that. But does that still seem like the likeliest compromise, even though it has now been demonstrated by Israel and the United States that their facilities can be hit at will any time?
Well, I think Iran is in a very bad position in this way, in that it has been trying to create, let's face it, everyone knows it has been trying to create an atomic bomb. It's really interesting that if you hear anybody defending Iran's position, once they're asked that question, why are you taking this enrichment to such a high degree? They never have an answer for it because they can't say, well, we want to create a bomb. I think Iran, as I say, is in a bad position because other people might have, like North Korea, has, we think, apparently 60 nuclear warheads, doesn't it? So other countries have got ahead and done it quietly. Iran seems to have attracted all this attention, made such a big thing of it, and it's still not in a position it would like to be in. I think probably coming back to Macron, I suspect one of the reasons why he wants to get involved, call me a cynic, but I've worked a lot with politicians, is that obviously he is going to be out of a job in a few years' time, isn't he? So he's still young, he's still energetic. What does he do? And I get a feeling that perhaps taking the lead here, especially when Europe is so short of proper sort of leadership still, even with Merz winning in Germany, I think perhaps he's positioning himself as that kind of a bit like Tony Blair, that kind of global diplomat who can perhaps bring together, these opposing forces.
Well, to the United States now, and to the depressing acquiescence of yet another entity to one of President Donald Trump's shakedowns. In this instance, it is Paramount Global, parent company of CBS, which has settled out of court to the tune of $16 million, a private lawsuit brought by Trump. He was vexed by the editing of a 60 Minutes interview with former Vice President Kamala Harris conducted during the 2022 election campaign, which Trump's lawyers claimed amounted to election interference and furthermore, that it had caused Trump emotional harm. They were seeking $20 billion. Simon, why would Paramount not just have told him to get knotted?
Well, I think this is an interesting example of the conflict that you so often get in media organisations between the business side on the one hand and the journalism on the other. I mean, the reason why they haven't told him to get stuffed, to put it politely, is of course that Paramount's controlling shareholder, Shari Redstone, needs the Trump administration's approval for an $8.4 billion merger with Skydance Media. So even though I'm told a lot of journalists at the station were very, very unhappy about this climb down, in terms of the sort of the big business strategy, then this is something they feel they've had to do. But it'll be interesting to see how other organisations, other major media organisations, which might need regulatory approval for different changes, for changes to their business, for mergers and acquisitions, are they going to have to kowtow as well to this very aggressive administration just to make sure that they can achieve their business goals?
Marta, it would not be the first time that an entity has decided, look, settling this for $16 million will frankly cost us less than trying to fight this through the court would. But might we not at least have hoped that any judge would have said, seriously, you're trying to sue somebody for editing an interview with a politician, like pretty much every non-live interview with a politician is edited, just for clarity, to remove hesitations and people going and so forth. As long as you don't significantly alter what they say, that's fine. And furthermore ruled that seriously, emotional harm, you're trying to sue for emotional harm, you might be in the wrong job.
What a snowflake, eh?
Yeah.
To me,
I mean, you can't imagine Teddy Roosevelt, for example.
No, but I think that the problem here is that it's just another confirmation of, I suppose, the US's not so slow descent into authoritarianism. The problem is that we are now at a point where I don't think anyone is in a position to trust a court in the United States to throw out something like this. And authoritarianism does not like a free press. I mean, Viktor Orban is once again a beacon of light for authoritarians around the world. He was just a few months ago announced a new transparency law that is anything but transparent and whose main effect is going to be to restrict even further media freedom in Hungary. So I think we see this really, it's part of this authoritarian playbook to try and restrain whatever it is that the press says about you. And this is, just confirming that the US is on a very, very dark path.
Simon, you mentioned that aspect that a lot of journalists at CBS are unhappy about this, and well, they might be. And though it's not the fault of those journalists obviously, but does the fact of this settlement not compromise all of CBS's reporting from now on, especially on Trump and the White House? Because everything they do report or don't report about him, the alert consumer is going to filter through the recollection of this settlement.
Yeah, I think that's a real concern. I mean, obviously, we'll have to wait and see if this merger that Shari Redstone wants to get through, once that gets through, will the editors, will the organisation feel a little bit more confident about treading on the Trump administration's toes? But even then, of course, they can always dangle threats in front of them. And I think this is just another example of a number of challenges that journalists face now. I mean, we were talking before, Marta, weren't we, about journalists being so frightened of getting sued, especially if they're freelance, they don't have a big organisation behind them, that they can't even get the insurance to, they have to play it safe. The other thing I think is interesting in this country and other countries is the defamation laws have been tightened. In other words, it's now harder to prove defamation. But the privacy laws have been greatly increased, which sounds like a good thing, definitely. The problem is it's people who are very powerful and have things to hide who now couldn't win on defamation, but in the UK and in other countries around the world can play the privacy card and say, actually, I'm not happy with what's being published here, and that's because it's damaging my privacy. And the thing is, obviously, the greatest proof against defamation defence is it's true. Whereas with privacy, it could still be true what you're writing, but the other person could successfully argue that you've trodden on or encroached on my privacy. So I think what we might see is another example of how the media will be driven out to kind of outlaw media, if you like. There'll be more coverage by organisations who don't feel they need to bow to business pressure or to regulatory requirements either.
But do the firms not understand, Marta? And there's been CBS, Paramount are not the first. We've also seen that settlement from ABC for $15 million last year. There's been various universities and law firms. Do they not understand, though, that's just inviting him to come back for another shot?
Yes, but I think that's the calculation that you're going to make, is that, again, you can still hope that next time this either won't happen, that he's only going to be in power maybe for 4 years and then he's going to stop. And that you're going to make the calculation that right now you cannot afford that kind of pressure and it's going to be cheaper to do this. And then in the future, you just monitor what journalists are doing much further. And I think that is what's really concerning, is that there is going to be a lot more scrutiny around what gets put out. And that is going to have a fairly chilling effect, I suspect, in terms of anyone writing anything that is likely to lead to a defamation lawsuit.
But if we look at the same proposition in the other direction, Simon, just finally on this, would there not be mileage in some media organisation thinking about the future and thinking about, here is where we can really set ourselves up? We will be the organisation that makes a whole thing of putting him under the scrutiny that somebody in his position should be under, because aside from anything else, he is not that popular. His disapproval rating is in the low 50s. It has not cleared 50% since he was sworn back in, and 75 million people did vote against him.
I think what's interesting, the danger is, of course, that the more the media does what he says and kowtows, the less likely it is that he I was going to say his successor, but let's face it, he could try and run again the way he's going. The less likely it is the more likely, that he or his successor will win the next election. So it's a kind of vicious circle here. But yeah, you're right. I think what's interesting is, as you say, many people did vote against him, Andrew. You're absolutely right. The problem is we've got in political terms, of course, is that the Democrats are all over the place. There is no political opposition, really, to Trump. So any kind of opposition, any ability to hold him to account really has got to come from the media. And so this is where they are going to have to really step up to the plate. And of course, just like politicians appealing to voters, the media has to appeal to audiences, readers, viewers, listeners. So tapping into those people who do want to hear a critical account of Trump and see him held to account, I think that's going to be an interesting challenge for the media in the US.
Well, on that subject, staying in the United States, as of this recording, efforts are ongoing to get President Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that is its real name, through the House of Representatives Representatives. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries has been doing his best to gum up proceedings, speaking for 8 hours or so and counting. Just checking there. House Speaker Mike Johnson claims to have the votes but wavering Republican lawmakers have reportedly been bribed with autographed photos of Trump and free hats. Isn't democracy marvellous? But is everything in the 940 pages of this legislative leviathan really all that terrible? Marta, for example, there was going to be a baby bonus, which does obtain in some countries, which is literally that. Congratulations, you've had a kid. Here is a sum of money. That has been scaled back somewhat to savings accounts for newborns, which will allow their families to contribute up to $5,000 a year, presumably for the infant to collect in due course. Are things like that a good idea? If we think it's a good idea for governments to make it a little bit easier for people to have families, if that's what they want to do, is this a way to do it?
This is probably not the way to do it. Or rather, there is a good case for free money when you have a child. Mm-hmm. Children are incredibly expensive, a little bit more expensive than dogs, I suspect.
But in fairness, like you can't send a dog up a chimney when it's 6 to sort of
true, and also at one point dogs won't work to pay for your pension. So there's that whole thing.
Swings and roundabouts.
Absolutely. So a baby bonus is something that you can justify, particularly because a lot of countries across the world, particularly in the Western world, are struggling with declining birth rates. So if you're trying to make having a child a more attractive proposition, perhaps offering some kind of support is a good measure. Mm-hmm. Even the idea of a savings account where the government gives you some free money is a potentially good idea if what you are trying to do is to rectify some kind of social imbalance, and you design this in a way that is progressive. So you don't say, okay, you're the child of a billionaire, you're only getting the 1,000. Your family is not particularly wealthy, then you're going to get something else. Because it helps close a wealth gap. Mm-hmm. But the way they've designed it doesn't really do that. So it's one of those things that, sure, it's potentially a good idea, but it might not be achieving what you think it is set to achieve. Though I don't really see Donald Trump caring that much about rectifying financial imbalances.
Well, indeed not. But on that subject, there are a couple of other provisions, Simon, which they claim will do that. There has been a slight extension of tax breaks on Social Security, which has been fanfared by official White House accounts as an end to tax on Social Security, which is just flatly untrue. And also claiming that they are going to end tax on tips and overtime, which again isn't entirely true. It is quite strictly limited. But do things like that help at all? I mean, are they in theory necessarily terrible ideas, is what we're trying to establish here?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because you might not like this bill, and it's interesting. Yeah, it's not particularly popular. I mean, just looking at a poll recently which shows that 55% of US voters are opposed to it and just 29% support it. And obviously the trouble that the Republican...
I would love to know what numbers that survey would have returned for do you actually know what's in it?
Well, that's exactly... It is a big bill with loads of stuff in it, and it changes, as you say, frequently as the administration tries to get it through Congress. But I mean, I think it's difficult. The thing with the tips, I think, is interesting because this is a big cultural and economic difference between Europe and the US, isn't it? I mean, we don't tend to tip much in Europe, even though perhaps Britain being between the two, we do a bit, whereas the US tipping is massive, isn't it? So I think there's a sort of socioeconomic issue here about to what extent do you expect people to rely on tips if they work in the service industry rather than having a decent salary. On the other hand, you know, if you want to get a tip, you work hard, you really charm your customers, you do your best, so it works well in that way. So I think there are opportunities here for some useful economic changes, but the problem is you've got the Trump bluster, and then on the other hand you've got the opposition to anything that comes from Trump. So there might be some good things in there that Trump has been forced to introduce or give way on to get it through Congress, which will probably be overlooked if it passes effectively.
Or do we suspect, Marta, just finally on this, that measures like that have been included and somewhat inflated as ballast to ram through what the bill's actual primary purpose is, which is to enshrine tax cuts for people who arguably don't really need them all that much?
This is what you do. This is the this is the problem with this kind of legislation that puts together a wild amount of things, is that you might be able to find a couple of measures in there that are interesting or progressive and good, even if they're coming from Donald Trump. As far as I'm concerned, I am for the complete abolition of tipping and actually paying people a living wage.
That's just crazy Bolshevik.
Yes, I am. I'm sorry. Here I am.
Well, you're European, one of the two.
I'm a European.
Well, you say tomato. Yeah.
But this is the problem is that when you're putting all these things together, you're creating a package deal, and the stuff that goes in there will usually include some incredibly unsavory things that you would not be able to pass by themselves. And that is the reason why it's really important to keep some scrutiny going, because it just happens. It doesn't happen just in the US. Something very similar happened in France with the migration law, where they threw in stuff that is obviously unconstitutional. But there you had a functionally constitutional court that said, you can't do that. The US doesn't really have that anymore.
Well, to London now, where further pedestrianisation is promised. A few weeks after the announcement that grotty shopping strip Oxford Street is to be turned into, in theory, a boulevard for saunterers, in practice, doubtless, a drag strip for cyclists and scooter riders, similar treatment is promised for Regent Street St James's, which leads south-ish from Piccadilly Circus to St James's Park. The plan will also enlarge the pedestrian space at Piccadilly Circus, enabling yet greater throngs of Italian teenagers with fluorescent backpacks to wonder why they've come to London to look at an advertising hoarding, plus establish cycling routes on Regent Street, which, who knows, some cyclists might even use. Simon, are we excited by all of this?
I think we're concerned, or I am anyway. I think it's a lovely idea, and I think we've all seen examples of where pedestrianisation has worked really well. Funnily enough, without thinking about this issue at all before I knew we were going to discuss it, I was actually in the City of London this morning, walking out of the Bank tube station like many hundreds of thousands of people, and I would always associate that with the roar of traffic. But this morning when I did it, a lovely sunny morning, it was almost silent. It was just wonderful. You could just hear people, the footsteps, which was wonderful. And then obviously we saw cyclists and things, and I think there was a bit of bell ringing, but fine, fair enough. But I thought, actually, this is a really interesting example of how removing or drastically reducing car usage has worked really well. On the other hand, I think, for instance, again in London, Trafalgar Square, opposite the National Gallery, I don't think it's worked so well at all, because, as you say, what we really need there is a lovely European-style cafe or something. So I think just removing cars, yes, you get rid of the noise and the pollution, but you've got to think really carefully, I think, about street furniture and other things you're going to put there to create the right environment, rather than just making it, like you say, a sort of windswept stretch of nowhere.
Does it also have to be made clear, Marta, and this is me shamelessly inserting my own prejudices by way of disguise as a question, that if you're going to pedestrianise an area, you have to emphasise and enforce that this is for pedestrians? To be clear, I am not at all against cycling. I think it should be encouraged and there should be a lot more of it, but I don't think cyclists and pedestrians mix terribly well.
I agree with you. I think in general, I'm going to share another very Bolshevik position, which is I think we should make it as hard as possible for people to drive. If there's a good alternative to driving, you should absolutely not be driving. And I think particularly in areas like that in London, I mean, I've walked down Oxford Street and people are going to walk in the middle of the road anyway, because there's too many people. So, but I also agree with you. I do cycle, but the street behaviour of cyclists is wild a lot of the time.
It is getting notitively worse.
It's getting noticeably worse because people are calling bikes things that are not bikes. They are, in fact, scooters or mopeds. They're just a little bit slower. And this is something I hadn't quite realised. I have a driving licence. I have done all of the tests. But I think a lot of people, if you've never taken a driving test, you don't really know how the road works. And there's no test for that. And that is something that I think is part of the problem. So I think it's good I agree with you. You need to make these places that are appealing for pedestrians, where you use the space intelligently to make it a pleasant space rather than just a strip. And it is probably true that cyclists should not be cycling in a pedestrian area because they're not cyclists, like they're not pedestrians.
Well, just in closing then, we should talk about, or we wanted to talk about favourite pedestrianised areas anywhere in the world, things that you think actually work really nicely. And I was thinking earlier that if I name one from, well, one of my hometowns back in the old country, in Manly on the north shore of Sydney Harbour, I'm old enough to remember when the shopping street known as the Corso was in fact just a street with cars and stuff going up and down it. It was pedestrianised, I mean, ages ago, I think in the late 1970s. And that's really nice because you can get off the ferry from Circular Quay. You do have to cross one road, possibly two now that I think of it, but they're no big deal. And then you've just got a nice walk along this sunny boulevard to the ocean beach on the other side of the peninsula. It's very pleasant.
I have to say, I'm slightly struggling to think of one. There are lots that I think are okay. There's, I think, the Rue Mouffard in Paris, which is a food street, is one that seems to work very well because it is very much a foodie street. Yeah. So, people do want to buy food and walk down the street eating it, or, there's plenty of opportunity there. So I think you've got to... So that works for me because it's the right kind of street with the right... retail off, if you like, and the right sort of street furniture. So that works well. And I think people could probably learn from something like that before they just go ahead and stop the traffic.
Yeah, I think I want to think of the small town of Scandicci, which is just outside of Florence, which is, it's sort of the
You've made that up, haven't you?
No, it's a small suburb where my family lives. But I think that there was this hugely controversial decision at one point to pedestrianize a street and not do it very intelligently because you could still drive through that street. But it really reinvigorated, I think, the city centre of this slightly weird suburban place. And I think I like it. I think it's a good way to give a sense of place to a city. And Florence did the same, a huge uproar when they did this in the city centre. But again, I think it's just so much better now. And there's too many people. We might as well all be walking in the middle of the road.
Makes sense.
Marta Lorimer and Simon Brooke, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, and by way of fanfaring the imminent newsstand appearance of Monocle's annual publication, in fact. Easy for me to say. The Entrepreneurs, a letter from me from a factory on the outskirts of Paris, which almost certainly made at least one thing you own. It was terribly tempting when preparing to visit the Bic factory on the outskirts of Paris for a story for Monocle's Entrepreneurs Annual to pack only a notepad and on arrival ask if, by any remote chance, they had a pen I could borrow. There are uncountable billions of Bic pens out in the world, millions more sold every year, and almost nobody remembers ever actually buying them. You almost certainly have at least a handful of Bic pens in your house, and equally likely not the faintest idea of how they got there. With all due acknowledgement that the ensuing observation will be fully appreciated only by a somewhat niche cohort, a similar paradox is often experienced by rock journalists of a certain age regarding Robin Hitchcock solo albums. From the 1986 outtakes compilation Invisible Hitchcock, which actually holds up pretty well now that I go back to it. If you bought, or were given, or stole off a colleague's desk a Bic pen in Europe, this is probably where it was made. Bic's factory is in Montévrain, about a 15-minute walk from the train station at Val d'Europe, the last stop before Disneyland. Mickey Mouse T-shirts adorn a small but excited cohort of passengers. The Bic building is liberally decorated with images of its own cartoon mascot. This is Bic Boy, the school kid with the Bic nib for a head. He's everywhere at Bic, on the overalls of staff, on cheery motivational posters, looming over the quality control stations where he is depicted squinting through a magnifying glass. Bic Boy was designed in the early 1960s by the artist Ramon Sauvignac. The history of the product he embodies goes back a couple of decades prior to that. Bic was founded by Marcel Biche, a man who contained multitudes. He was, to all outward appearances, the eccentric European aristocrat to the point of self-parody, collector of art, racer of yachts, heir to some obscure baronetcy. But Biche was also obsessed to distraction with design, believing that everyday utilitarian objects could and should be elegant as well as efficient. In 1945, he bought the patent for the ballpoint pen from the Hungarian inventor Laszlo Biro. One of Biche's sons, Bruno, succeeded him as Bic's CEO. The incumbent, though he plans to step down later in 2025, is one of Biche's grandsons, Gonzalve. Bic has made many other things besides pens, lighters, razors, even windsurfers, but it is the pen with which Bic has become nearly as synonymous as Biro, and which Bic still cranks out in bewilderingly prodigious quantities. At the factory, I pass one machine which has spent the morning assembling Bic crystals, the basic Bic pen, these ones filled with red ink, possibly soon to be slathered across hapless essays in the form of passive-aggressive notes from seething teachers. A digital counter on top of the contraption records the number of crystals assembled since this shift started 4.5 hours ago. 44,723, each of which will write for 3 kilometres. That's a lot of angry circles around misplaced apostrophes. Disappointingly, for a journalist old enough to remember when furious lunatics had to write in by hand, I do not get to see this morning any pens being filled with green ink, always the traditional medium of the irate and insane. The closest I get is the room in which Bic's famous 4 colour pens, blue, black, red, green, are assembled. The 4-colour was first sent to market in 1970, but was subtly tweaked a couple of years ago. A small hole was punched out of the spherical nub at the top of the pen, and a Bic Boy-shaped silhouette drilled through the clip. At Bic's astonishing scale of manufacture, worldwide the company claims to make nearly 24 million items every day, these barely perceptible reductions saved enough plastic to make another 2.6 million pens every year. The 4 colours are assembled by an extraordinary carousel-shaped device. There is something genuinely mesmerising about seeing Bic's largely self-designed machinery up close, not just in the precise and hypnotic rhythms of its physical movement, but in the thought that so much ingenuity has gone into producing something so basic indeed that we spare it barely a thought. That's kind of a preview of The Entrepreneurs, which will be on sale later this month and does include my report from the Bic factory near Paris. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Marta Lorimer and Simon Brooke. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.